All right, well, welcome to September 14th edition of Workgroup Meeting. So first up on the agenda, I have put together a proposed 116 release schedule. Folks, when you get the time, please take a look, and any feedback is welcome. If I don't hear anything from you by end of day tomorrow, I will publish this as the official 116 schedule. And this time around, we've already identified the primary, secondary, and tertiary release managers, so we should be able to get started right away. And please feel free to reach out to me on Slack if you have any questions. With that short announcement, let's go to the second line item. RFC Simplified Istio multi-tenancy. This is Fasila.
Hi, Francis. I'm here. Or maybe you can just open the RFC.
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay, so this RFC we have created a few weeks back about simplifying Istio multi-tenancy. So the background and objective is already mentioned here. We know that there are a lot of RFCs already in place for Istio multi-tenancy, and different concepts have been already discussed. And the RFC, whatever I have created here, have a few review comments already from John and others from the community. So there are a lot of concerns or confusions regarding the requirements part. So before going to the implementation details, I thought it's better to discuss this in the meeting about the various requirements or the different issues, whatever we have currently when we try to realize multi-tenancy, and understand the overall feedback from the community on fixing some of these issues or moving forward. Because after the review comments in the document, it was more or less proposed that we shouldn't be doing some of these changes, rather use some additional concepts or technologies which are already present in Istio, but we just wanted to explain why those things are not sufficient for us. And so I have my colleagues, some of my colleagues here with me in the meeting. So I thought we can just try to present this requirements part here to understand the overall feedback. So Ingo, would you like to present the requirements part?
Yes. First of all, hello everyone. So the requirements part, I see you have, you are just showing it here on the screen as well. I don't know if we need to go through all the items here or if we should go directly to the comments. When Fasila, when you discussed this, and I think you discussed it a lot with John and maybe some other people as well, he was telling that the first thing to do should be to clearly list the requirements that we have and also put together proper roles that we need for such a multi-tenant deployment. And that is basically what you did and what you put together here on the requirements part. And I think there were some comments to it. Should we just go through these comments, or do you have any questions to these requirements? Or Fasila, do you think we should go?
I think John just joined the meeting, so maybe we can just discuss about the comments and concerns and only focus on that part.
Yeah, then maybe Francis, you can scroll down a bit to the comments that have been included there. There are the first comments.
Further down or here?
No, I think that's fine. So the first comment here from John was about what additional security do we get here that couldn't be done with network policy, authorization policy, and other things. So if you scroll up a little bit, I think, Fazila, you showed here two possible models for multi-tenancy. And here it's using one control plane, and in the control plane having multiple tenants. And one way is to realize that with the means we have today in Istio, and that would basically mean to use network policies for traffic separation and authorization policy and custom trust domains. So that is just one solution. Then the other solution, which is then shown in the lower picture, is still using a single control plane, but have an additional isolation by using different CA certificates and different certificate authorities, basically. And there, John was actually asking if there are what additional security is there. I don't think there's much additional security that you get. It's maybe safer because you don't need to set network policies, authorization policies, and all these things because you will get it out of the box if you use different CA certificates for the different tenants. So I think it's more like a simplified solution.
Yeah, I guess like my kind of broader issue with this is multi-tenancy is complicated. It means a different thing to everyone, right? Sometimes very different things. And so I feel like we either, like there's kind of three different paths we can go down. One is to say, here is what my use case for multi-tenancy is, and I'm going to implement a design that meets that specific case, and it's going to be great. There's another one that's like, here's all these building blocks for a multi-tenancy. Like here's an option that says only look at this namespace, and here's the one that says, I don't know, use a different root CA for different things. And there's all these different ones, and it's not a great user experience, but multi-tenancy is typically expert users, so they can mix and match them together to build their own multi-tenancy. And then the other one is like, okay, we really go all in on multi-tenancy, make it like super crisp, all sorts of different multi-tenancies. Like we have the out-of-the-box solutions for them. You just say like, I want multi-tenancy variant X, and like it all just works. And what I've been having a hard time with is that I don't know where we're going, and so it's a bit tricky because we're kind of doing all three at once. And I think we need to be clear what we're doing and then do it very well instead of like being kind of unclear and partially doing all of those, if that makes sense.
Yes, sure. That makes sense. And what is shown here is like all different possibilities you have for implementing multi-tenancy. And this is not showing yet the need we have. The need we have is basically to use separate control planes. And the use case we have is, since we are a telco company, we provide cloud-native based telco applications. And these are applications that are pre-integrated by ourselves. And we deliver them to a customer, typically a network operator, which has clusters, which typically come even from another vendor, like OpenShift or whatever. And they deploy the applications there. And we don't know how such a cluster looks like. We don't know if there is a service mesh, for example, already added to the cluster. And we also don't know what kind of service mesh. I mean, it might be Istio, might be Linkerd. We don't know which version, whatsoever. So, and we can also not really put requirements on it. So therefore, what we did and what we decided is, since we want to make use of service mesh and its feature, that we put the service mesh inside our application. That's really our use case. And the application should be completely separated, so it should be possible to install it in a cluster. but it should only operate on the application itself. Also, the included service mesh there should only operate on this application and not impact and influence anything else in the cluster. And that is also what I put as a response to your next comment, John, I think.
Yeah, so I guess
that is really the use case and the background for it.
I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around why these users are fine with using a shared Kubernetes version, a shared Linux version, kernel, nodes, all this system, but then Istio is somehow, like, what is special about Istio that's not in those? And is that something that's actually true going forward long term, or because we are a less mature product than Kubernetes in the past and had more changes between versions?
I think the problem is that most operators, they have standard Kubernetes clusters, but they don't have necessarily a service mesh, as I said before, right? So, and if we require the service mesh now, if we say we have applications, but they only work if you have Istio service mesh in the cluster, then it's up to our customer to make sure that the Istio service mesh is in the cluster, which would be an additional component. And then there must be someone responsible for this service mesh, for maintaining it, for installing it, for operating it, and also for troubleshooting, right? If there's any issue, then the question is it because of the service mesh?
Someone already has to do all of that for
Kubernetes,
right? All of that still applies to the outer Kubernetes cluster.
No, another way to think. I mean, if you have one Istio installer, or you have 10, it's still the same problem. You still need to maintain it. You instead of having one problem, you have 10 problems, which is compounded by the fact that they interacting with each other. They may interact with each other in very subtle ways. They may be different versions. The CNI plugin, for example, kind of has to be shared. I understand your use case, and it's very valid, and it's very important for Istio to support your use case. I think, John, and at least my concern is that it may not be the universal use case that everyone needs. And it will be far more important to make sure we have the building blocks to make sure you can satisfy your requirement and deploy however you see fit. So if there is anything missing in Istio today that prevents you from doing that, then we should fix it. I mean, we have support for multiple routes here. You can customize what certificates you get in 10 different ways. I don't think there is any use case we cannot satisfy, but we can add more. Discovery, we have the filter, so we cannot building blocks to kind of fine tune each of the features. But I'm not sure putting them together in a single packet that is we pretend it's simple when it's actually far more complicated than a single installation. I don't think that will benefit our users or it will help us long term, especially with ambient and other things coming where we are trying to have per node proxies and to kind of improve resource usage and do other things. If we start slicing and dicing that two pods on the same node have different version of Istio, different discoveries, have completely different certificates and other things, it becomes very, very complicated very fast.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we want like the user experience of Istio to be like, regardless of how it's installed, kind of like Istio as a service for application systems. Like, they should not have to care about Istio. They just say, give me Istio functionality, right? I really think that's the best user experience especially for a system like this, where your tenants just come. If they want Istio, they add a label. If they don't want Istio, they don't add the label, and they get that.
Yeah, maybe the first thing regarding how to manage it, because you were mentioning, like, if now multiple applications using service mesh, you have multiple control planes and you have multiple management. So how we do it in the typical telco use case is that the maintenance of the application, the lifecycle management and everything is done. There's also a standardized tool for it. Is done as part of lifecycle management of the application. So if you, for example, need to upgrade the application, you will upgrade the whole thing. And it might be that you also will use a new service mesh version in this new upgraded application. So as part of the upgrade process, you would also upgrade, for example, the service mesh control plane and proxies.
That's very reasonable. But what cannot you do today with Istio? Because with Istio, it's the building blocks you have. I believe you can do exactly what you want without any major changes in Istio.
Yeah, you could do it also without, but then you need to have some person being responsible of managing and handling Istio on the cluster, right? And
no, I mean deploy an Istio per namespace, for example. You can deploy an Istio per namespace with the label selectors, with a separate certificate, with everything, and you get the result you want. Basically, each team can deploy its own Istio if that's what you want.
Ingo, maybe we can just scroll down a bit and show what are the issues we are facing currently when we try. I don't know where it was. Yeah.
Is it here?
There is some problem section. I think it's just below this. Yeah, well, you can, yeah, here only. Yeah.
So John and Cosmo still have their hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say two things. Like everything you're saying that is hard to do with Istio, you already have to do that with Kubernetes. So the argument isn't terribly convincing to me. But the other thing is that it's actually even better with Istio, because with Kubernetes, you can have one version. With Istio, the cluster operator could install multiple versions. You could install all the versions. You could install, just one that's like rapid and one that's stable, however you want to do it using the revision feature. And that way, your individual tenants can choose what version they want. It doesn't mean that they all have to run their own Istio necessarily.
Yeah, but the thing is that the cluster is not operated by us. And
who is it operated by then? I'm a bit confused. So you have one cluster, it's operated by someone, and then there's tenants within that cluster that are operated by different people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
the cluster might be operated
the cluster?
by a telecom network provider, I don't know, Verizon, T-Mobile, whatever. We are selling application to, let's say, T-Mobile, and they install it on their cluster, our application.
So basically,
they might not only install application from us, but also application from other vendors on the same cluster.
And how do you know that they are giving you a Kubernetes cluster that is appropriate for your application?
Yeah, it's standard Kubernetes clusters that they use. So,
well, there's no standard for Kubernetes, right? So you're making some assumptions, and it seems like you won't make the assumption that Istio is installed there, but you will make all sorts of other assumptions. Which I'm not saying your use case is wrong and that you're lying to me or anything like that. But this is, like, we need to have a generalized solution. And this feels like a very, very niche case where you're okay making all sorts of assumptions, but not one that they will install Istio on the cluster, which to me seems very, very specialized to your use case.
Yeah,
I think there's a middle ground. There's a middle ground here. I mean, I agree with you mostly, but most of the things that are listed here are relatively valid concerns that could be improved. So if they want to do, basically, it's a kind of user mode Istio where Istio is not installed as a cluster-wide controller, but it has a limited visibility. And we discussed in the past about having kind of no cluster permission or minimizing the permissions required by Istio. For example, injection. You can use kube inject if you want. I mean, we still support it, so we don't have to depend on a single injection for everything. Or you can deploy Istio I think today if you don't have the cluster-wide permissions, we mostly watch only what we can and ignore some of it. So there are some things we can do.
I'm totally fine with adding a bunch of small little pieces that someone could piecemeal, build their own multi-tenancy. Yep. I don't know about all of them. We have to review them on case-by-case basis, obviously. Most of these seem fairly reasonable. And many you can probably already do today. Mm-hmm. But I'm not terribly convinced that this is something that we should go, doc on Istio IO, multi-tenancy, here's how it works. It's super secure. This is common use case, this out-of-the-box thing. But all these flags, and we have some of them already, right?
he would
Yeah,
try
but the
proposing
big
some of
question
these
I have
changes.
here, right, is
Go ahead.
the hardest part with all of this, right? Like if you're relying on namespaces, tenancy boundary, you're still very dependent on cross namespace identity, right, for permissioning, right, authorization policy. Right, if you look at like the ambient model, right, you could very easily see a way where, you know, if the L3, L4 and identity concerns were handled by an infrastructure layer, right, you know, anything within a namespace could have a different control plane, right? Right, you can have a revision per namespace for things happening at L7. But it's going to be really tricky, right, without cluster-wide or you know, multi-cluster wide support for identity to actually have a coherent policy system in place. So, Custom, by the way, yeah, what I'm saying is that you need the bottom part of ambient, right, as infrastructure provided by the platform, right, which includes the identity part. You can obviously have the L7 parts be implemented by different controllers, like you could swap out the waypoint proxies, right, and have your policies and like iterate on those in different ways. That's fine, but I wouldn't want to, right, your authorization policy, if you're creating different identity domains, it's going to be very hard to facilitate cross namespace communication in a coherent way unless you have a common identity model within the cluster. Right, and Kubernetes has a common identity model within the cluster, right? Like there are service accounts for everything. There's a flat namespace for them. And you're going to rely on authorization policies referring to identities in other namespaces, right? So that has to be treated as shared infrastructure anyway. That's implied.
There are ways around it. I mean, you can use a different CA and you can, you know, kind
No,
of.
no, but that's artificially partitioning the identity domain, right? You're still running.
Namespace is not artificial. I mean, namespace is a boundary.
Right. Yeah. So like the cluster provides identity, right?
Yeah.
Identity is infrastructure in the cluster. So there's no point partitioning it.
Yeah, in the current SPIFFE identity format, we have namespace and the service account. It doesn't associated with a specific control plane on. It's not represented in the identity.
Like if you like gave them different routes, all you're doing is taking a uniform identity domain and making them unable to talk to each other. It doesn't add value.
Unless you explicitly configure the trust route, which is very complicated, but it's possible. I mean, I don't think identity is really the problem here. I think identity can be made to work.
Right. So I think what we're saying, at least what I'm saying is, there's no value in having a different CA per namespace, right? Because Kubernetes is already guaranteeing that you don't have a different identity domain per namespace. Beyond that, right, versioning the system at the L7 policy layer, you know, is a more reasonable request. I think it would get easier with ambient if ambient was provided as infrastructure. I think it's a little harder, and certainly the API management parts are harder here, right? Because CRD versioning and things like that.
And to really have the identity separations for different control planes, then even the SPIFFE identity model needed to be changed.
Yeah, no, I certainly Ingo, I get the point. Ambient was only like published last week. The requirement was still like the identity requirement would still be the same. Right, you wouldn't want to vary the CA by namespace. I don't think that adds value. So then it's really just, you know, cluster-wide, like CRDs are a problem regardless. Cluster-wide permissioning, you know, those are things that could probably be addressed today. The other problem, though, Ingo, you're going to face, right, is the tension between you maintaining the system and the platform administrator maintaining the system as well, right? Particularly for security patches and CVEs, right? You like, I imagine the goal is to have a high SLO contract with someone you're providing the service to, and you're going to provide maintenance of Istio itself. I don't think there's anything unreasonable with that. Like we even allow for Istio, the Istio control plane to be implemented outside of the cluster. So there are many for these things today. There are some things that are hard because of how Kubernetes deals with things, but you can actually get quite far. And I think in the ambient model, this would become a little bit easier because the only thing you would really need to be controlling was the waypoints.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the ambient mesh changes a lot, and there things are really different, and then it will be probably even harder to realize what we want, like having separate control planes.
Well, I doubt that's actually true. I think you'd find the opposite is true.
Okay.
Well, if you were running in a Kubernetes cluster that was using a CNI just for secure L3, L4 overlay, you know, Calico or Cilium, one of those, how would you operate? Ambient is no different than that. There is literally no difference.
Well, ambient gives you a lot of power on with the PEPs. I mean, with the
right. Like we provide a framework to let you inject the L7 parts into the system, and it sounds like that's the thing you want to control the versioning of.
Yeah. And also, I would point that ideally in such an advanced use case, you probably would not use Citadel and the self-generated certificates. You probably would use some tooling that is provisioning, platform level that is provisioning certificates, whatever identities you need. And they may need different routes if you want to, kind of have complete isolation between. That's your use case, and it's between the certificate authority and provider and whatever you configure to generate certificates and your use case. But Istio is mostly, I mean, the part where Istio is important discovery and how you can, kind of what you watch and how you control the endpoints that are returned. And that's the part where we can make some changes to improve what we have. I would leave identity out of this, basically.
Yeah, the one building block we tried proposing in the past that can't be currently solved is the custom resource export import enforcement. Like a tenant basically should be isolated from other tenants' custom resource modifications, even if they do or do not set export to and sidecar scoping features. So it would be good to at least get a building block to prevent basically config leakage if we specifically set up a tenant to have a boundary in that namespace or the namespaces.
Oh yes, I mean absolutely. I mean I think beyond the multi-tenancy, I mean fixing the cross namespace visibility and all those issues, I think that should be a super high priority for Istio, because we have the gateway API coming, which is very strict about identity and namespaces and visibility. We have a lot of security problems related with cross namespace. So this, I think, if anything, should be P0. It's fixing the cross namespace, weakness in Istio, basically enforcing service export, having a mode where we strictly don't go look outside the namespace, and maybe can be done with adopting the gateway API. Maybe it can be done by fixing the APIs. But I completely agree. We should certainly do that.
Yeah, that would help us a lot. It's basically also one of the main building blocks, which I think is also included in the document.
Another difficulty for the isolation of multiple control plane is on the webhooks. So the Kubernetes validating webhook and mutating webhook, they don't support like multiple tenants within the same namespace. So essentially, your mutating webhook doesn't really have isolations to separate different control planes.
Yeah, I think it is already mentioned in the document, and I think John had already given a comment about how it can be solved if we don't want to make changes in the Istio code. So we were analyzing that as well. And the second bullet point in the document on the page which is currently displayed. So do we agree that at least the custom resources part we can fix, or maybe we don't want to advertise this as something like multi-tenancy, Istio supports multi-tenancy, but at least if we can get some of those building blocks which are causing issues for us, that would be good enough for us.
So I do want to be cognizant of the time. We are over half an hour on this topic already, and there's still other topics. Can we resolve this issue today, or do we need offline collaboration?
Yeah, I guess we cannot solve everything today, so it's probably reasonable to continue offline. And I think what we kind of agreed on now in this discussion is that we want to focus on this custom resource isolation as the main building block. And I think everyone agrees that this is important. Maybe Gateway API can be used to a certain degree, but yeah, we use current Istio, and Gateway API is still something to become. So we would like this support also for existing custom resources, like Sidecar, Virtual Service Destination Rule, and so on.
One more point, I don't want to confuse it too much, but Istio has some way to operate without CRDs. I mean, there is in mesh configs, there is a setting to load all the configs from file system basically, and you can create a config map if you want. There is XDS over MCP over XDS where you can have your own custom server that is returning the configs without any dependency to Kubernetes. So there are ways to address it already if that's your main problem. You could pretty much operate Istio without Kubernetes today if you know how to do it and if you use the building blocks correctly. So, but again, I don't know if you should do that. I would rather stick with the Gateway API because again, the main benefit is that it has clear isolation, which fits your use case in this particular case.
Okay, so Ingo, is this something you can take offline with John, Louis, and Costin?
Yes, sure. Let's follow up this offline then. The main contact person from our side will be Fazila.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, so let's move on to the next item. Marco.
Hey, yeah, so want to propose the beta promotion plan for the external authorization. And gather feedback from the community first, and get review on this promotion plan, and further get approval. The so external authorization is currently in alpha stage, and there are asks from community for when to move to the next stage, beta, and in the future stable. So this doc is gathering all the requirements for promote external authorization to the beta feature. So the list down here is gathered from the requirements from the Istio enhancements. So the items that struck through are the already like it is requirements as well for the alpha. So those are already finished. So the remaining items mainly mainly on the performance test. And I have a performance test plan. If you scroll down to a performance test plan section, the mainly for testing latency for the external authorization is we need to test the latency on that. Now depends on the provider part. So this is roughly what we need to test. Yeah. Any feedback, questions?
So Marco, whose sign off do you need this on?
I believe will be from security and networking working group leads.
This sounds reasonable to me, Marco.
Cool.
Yeah, sounds good to me as well.
So that counts as sign off from security. What about from the networking side?
I have one question. How does it work with ambient? Does anyone know? Or does it work? We'll have to deprecate it when, or not support it for users ambient, or we'll support it. John?
I think, I mean, I haven't tested or anything, but conceptually it should work. We'll only support it on the waypoint proxy.
No, I was asking for micro proxy for the per node. I mean,
oh, it won't be. Yeah, I don't think we should support it for that.
So can we promote only the L7 part of the authorization policy and not promote L4 until we have an answer?
I think we can separate that cost and just say if you want to use x.z for L4, you have to have waypoint. Right?
Yeah, we'll make a similar statement for every single field in the API except for like
Okay,
three
that is fine.
we will have to have a better answer for that in ambient on how like users actually understand that set, but I don't think that needs to block this.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, any customization or integration like this custom is going to require waypoint, right? Because we don't want to put complex dependencies like this into the Z tunnel layer. Right, so this would be true for like WASM, right? Obviously, like we're not going to support WASM at L4 with Z tunnel. You don't have to have a waypoint.
So if we detect an authorization policy that applies to L4, will automatically redirect to the waypoint? Or
we'll probably have to have validation on the APIs.
Okay, no, that's fine. I mean, that's reasonable. Just want to make sure that we take into account how it works with microprocessors.
Okay, so in terms of networking sign off, Constantine, would that be you?
I don't know, but I'm okay with it.
Do we have any networking working group leads here?
I don't remember if I'm networking on environments anymore.
I don't remember if I'm a networking lead anymore. I think I was
You're not, John.
drop down, but
Let's assume it is approved. I don't know.
I'm just gonna say Constantine and John.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think John, you and I can approve it as GMEC members.
yeah, I think this is fine.
Lynn, did you have any objection to that?
Well, I guess I wasn't sure how it works with ambient. I mean, not particularly regarding beta promotion. It's just, I was just thinking external OSC, how it works with ambient, because I know we've been having issue with envoy filter with ambient with waypoint proxy. Yeah, but not particularly issue related to the promotion.
Okay, I think that's.
To be clear, this is only for the fields in the authorization policy, not the mesh config. Just double checking.
Yeah, so the promotion is to replace the need to use envoy filter, which is before the external OSC API exists, right?
No, I mean, there are two parts of the API. There is a part in authorization policy and a part in mesh config. I think we are discussing only the one in authorization policy.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, but I assume under the cover is still using envoy filter to implement that, no?
No, mesh config is the one where we specify the provider.
Yeah, this doesn't use Envoy filter under the hood.
No Envoy filter whatsoever. Yes.
This is
okay.
the custom rule in authorization policy, which triggers a call to an X.C provider.
But under the cover, when we plug in the call to call the external provider in Envoy, is that not needing using Envoy filter under the cover either?
It doesn't use the Envoy filter API to do it. It's actually a built-in part of the control plane.
Yes, I understand that. So we have abstraction API, but under the cover, do we internally using Envoy filter?
Yeah, that will use the Envoy X or Z.
Lynn, are
Yeah.
you referring to the Envoy filter API that Istio has, or are you referring to Envoy filters?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I was referring to the Envoy filter API Istio has, which I think initially when we implement external OSC, when we provided the solution to the community, like when it's alpha, we were giving people examples of how to do it with Istio Envoy filter. But I understand the external OSC API is supposed to save user from using the Istio Envoy filter because we provide a higher level abstraction. But under the cover, do we still need to use Istio Envoy filter? Not at all? Okay.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's through the Envoy. Envoy external OSC. There's a built-in filter in Envoy. It's not.
Oh, okay, got you. So that's a native filter from Envoy, which eliminate the needs for Istio to use the Istio Envoy filter API.
I think we're conflating two things again here, right? The Envoy filter API in Istio was a directive to the control plane. Now this feature is implemented by code in the control plane. The use of the X.Z filter in Envoy hasn't changed. Right? That feature has existed for a long time and is still stable. Right, but what we're not doing, because we're not using the Istio Envoy filter API, is causing all the upgrade and maintenance issues that we had with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're promoting the abstraction we built on top of that.
Yes.
To beta, but not the mesh config portion, which is typically not configured by the application owner anyway.
Yep.
Correct.
Okay. Anything else on this topic? All right. If not, let's see. Let's discuss the next two. So, Prudel, are you here?
Yes. Yeah, could you open the issue?
Yes.
Right. So I think this motivation for this was before introducing Istio in our stack, we ran into an issue where Kubernetes control plane was degraded, and by degraded I mean it was not available. The root cause for that is different, but the manifestation of that was API server was not available for kubelets to post their statuses, but control manager was able to access API server and started marking all the nodes as not ready, and subsequently the pods hosted on those nodes are also considered as not ready. So when that happens, control plane unavailability is impacting the data plane steady state. So for that issue, while we have we have addressed it in our internal constructs when before Istio. That was a story before Istio. So with introducing Istio, so we were seeing Istio will have long-running connections to the API server. They may or may not able to reach API server in the event where they are continue to get updates from API server, which are made by control manager. So they Istio will see all the pods become being marked as not ready, and it will propagate those changes to all envoy proxies. So that behavior we want to have a control how to still consider propagating not ready endpoints to the proxies, so that still isolate the data plane and the active data paths between workloads. So yes, that's the issue. Yeah. Go ahead, Scott.
Is it specifically for draining, or do you have other? What is your primary use case?
Primary use cases, when API server is not available, the nodes, the pods are being marked as not ready, right? So the impact of that is Istio consuming those updates and removing those endpoints from the healthy endpoints. So that is the impact. So we want to have a control dynamically in allowing proxies and Istio to continue use not ready endpoints for while the issue is in effect, is active, right? So the one provision. Go ahead.
How does the endpoint get into the non-ready state? Is it failing a readiness check?
They're not failing readiness checks. So while the issuers kubelet on a node is still able to reach the pods and able to do all health checks, and the pods are healthy. But the issuers kubelets on the nodes are not able to reach API server, not able to post their health status.
Oh, and the API server will remove them if this happens?
That's the behavior. API server, based on a parameter, if it doesn't, control manager essentially, if it doesn't get a health heartbeat or health check from the nodes, it considers node as unavailable and marks the nodes as. Yes.
And is there any way to distinguish between when this happens and a real failure of health? Because the real concern for this is if a health check fails because the endpoint is really unhealthy for real reasons, we don't want to send traffic to it, obviously. So for draining, for example, which is another use case where this is discussed, there is a way to tell that an endpoint is terminating, and we can keep sending requests for it because it's actually not in a bad state, it's just terminating. But do we have here something to indicate, or
yeah, at this moment, yes, at this moment, Istio is contacting API server, and the status of the endpoint is not is the same in both the scenarios. While the pod is the two scenarios is when the pod is failing readiness probes, which is genuinely unhealthy, and the second scenario is where node is not able to reach API server, where API server is in a degraded state. There's no way to differentiate these two scenarios.
Yeah.
So that's where the limitation comes. Yeah. So objective is, how do we still have the isolation of still protect the workloads while control plane is degraded, right? Yeah, I see this provision pilot send unhealthy endpoints. It's a flag, environment flag at the boot up of Istio. Yeah, we were running on 113, but this has been introduced in 114. So we are yet to explore when can we what is the behavior, and can we have this always ready and rely on outlier detection, active passive health checking of the workload, so that Istio and proxies can always be consume all endpoints, and outlier detection could could remove unhealthy endpoints period. Is probably we were exploring that, but yeah, thought of bringing up this scenario and how taking community's opinion.
So why was Istio D reachable but the API server was not? Because what should happen, right? If Istio D becomes unreachable from the sidecars will just keep their current configuration state, which is actually the behavior that you're trying to get here, right? So how is Istio D able to read from the API server, but kubelets were not able to reach the API server?
Well, kubelet cannot write different.
Right, because what you could have done in this situation is just dropped Istio D, right? Like killed it. And all the sidecars would have stayed up with their current state.
Yes, you're right. So as a quick mitigation, if we just bring down Istio D, all the proxies will hold the status quo.
Right, so that has the same logical behavior as a dynamic flag, right?
Yes, yeah.
Right, so I'm not sure that you need the flag because you could just do that. And the question still remains, why was Istio D able to reach the API server, but kubelets weren't? It's an odds network partition.
Yeah, so it's a API server. It's not a network failure. It is the scenarios that we have seen as API server was overwhelmed. I mean, the node health checks are individual post updates to the node lease entity in the API in the control plane, which are not longer, which are made individual post or put API calls. Whereas Istio D holds uses watches, which are long running connections. They may not get interrupted, or they may not. Yeah, so that's the difference between the kubelet interaction versus Istio D's interaction.
Okay, so I mean, either way, like I don't think we need the dynamic flag, right? If you consider the right, you want shared fate between Istio D and the Kubernetes API server, right? If the Kubernetes API server has an outage, you want Istio D to have an outage too. That should be the desired state. Right?
Yes.
Now, the fact that there's a quirk in like the API server's availability for some APIs but not others is problematic. I'm not sure that we can necessarily solve that. And I don't think the dynamic flag is going to help you here. The production best practice would have been to take out Istio D until the API server had recovered.
Taking out Istio D is not going to solve the problem completely, because it's a manual intervention, right? That's what we are seeing. So
right,
by the time,
well, I mean, you could automate the intervention, right? If there's some aspect of the API server health.
Which API server? Which API server? Because in multi-cluster you watch 5 API servers. One is down.
Oh, sure, right. But like, how would you establish this contract in production? Right. What you want to do is say, if the API server logically is degraded, I want Istio D to have deliberately become degraded. Right.
If we had a way to find out, yes, absolutely.
Right. And the problem is it's not easy to find out. And right, in this case, it seems like there's either a provisioning problem in the platform or there's a bug in the API server. It's not clear that we can write code to automatically handle that. Right, and so any flag, right, requires manual intervention. Right? Dynamic or static?
How dynamic flag would be better in this scenario is any automation would have delays or even manual intervention, right?
No, but you can have any automation that can set a flag is also automation that could kill the Istio D. There's really no difference between those two things.
Yeah. So in the
because if you kill Istio D, other things will not start if they restart. I mean,
sure, but that's fine, right? They're not starting anyway, custom, right? The API server is not going to start.
No, but you need to recover at some point. So, I mean, it's
sure, but then you bring it back up, right?
I don't think we disagree about this. That this flag is probably not the best solution, but I think one of the things you mentioned is that using an alternative like live reporting. I mean, using health checks from Envoy or doing an alternative bypassing basically Envoy, Kubernetes mechanism for health check, and using one of the Envoy mechanisms for health check. And I think that's not.
But we already do that, right?
We do that, but to some extent. I mean, it's not.
Sure, but I'm saying that that's already part of the system, right? So I don't think that's what the issue is here.
The issue is not aware of the health check. If we had load, I mean,
No, it's not. But right, what we're trying to say is, if the API server has a degradation issue, we want to halt endpoint propagation. Right, the Envoy doesn't help with that. Right, Envoy helps with passive health checking and draining things that are unhealthy when we don't have other health checking state.
Louis, one approach is holding the endpoint, holding the propagation further, or the other approach what we had in mind while asking for this dynamic flag was when by the time any intervention is happening, so some of the propagation could have happened. By enabling this dynamically, we will propagate both not ready endpoints as well. So whatever.
Okay. So this is more about recovery than prevention.
Yes.
How do you propagate if the writes are that slow and broken? How do you propagate this flag? Because you need to write some config map or something in Kubernetes itself, which is down.
Yeah, if the API server is down, degraded, any dependency on API server config maps is also not reliable. So
including setting this flag. So you would not have a way to set this flag in the first place, though.
While the nodes are maybe directly executing into the Istio pods and then executing.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, config map is not a reliable route because.
I understand now. I understand what you're. So it's more a recovery, not a permanent flag, but something that you want in emergency. You have some ways to turn some knobs in Istio that would allow you to recover. That's a different story. I think that's not completely unreasonable for. Including what Louis was saying. I mean, the API server is down. You don't kill Istio. You have a flag that says stop watching or don't trust API server effectively. This is not really about unhealthy endpoint. It's about not trusting what the API server is reporting because it's degraded. There is something there. I mean, I think especially with multi-cluster where you can say, hey, this API server is degraded. Don't trust
any difference than setting the if you're execing into the pod, right? Is there any difference between just like what you just described and like restarting the process inside the pod, having mutated the environment variable? Like I'm like one.
You cannot do that in Kubernetes, unfortunately. You cannot kill it and restart. I mean, if it's dead, it's terminates the pod.
No, not the pod, because like restart the process inside the pod. Like you've SSH'd into the thing.
Yeah, but you kill it's process one, unfortunately. We don't have any terminates the pod. But we cannot. We don't have to use the environment, but we can watch your files. That's fine. We can address this. Yeah, no, I think.
Yeah, I mean it's not a lot of people are going to use this, right? Because this is pretty advanced.
It's for advanced users for sure. Definitely not for beginners.
Yeah, but
how often does this happen to you guys?
So the incident where API server degraded, we as and when I think that so far in the past 2 years, I recall it happened thrice for 3 different reasons. Right, we are also getting better with every incident, and we are taking measures to make it robust. But yeah, before Istio, some provisions we made that has guarded us for a new incidents we have seen. For any unforeseen scenarios that we were to run into, we want to isolate control plane availability issues and still safeguard the data path in some sense, or at least have measures to mitigate quickly.
Yeah, I think for advanced operators, I think it's not an invalid use case. Probably not with exec, because the API server is down, you cannot exec. Maybe we'll some XDS control interface where with some credentials can turn some of those emergency flags on and off. I mean, I design doc probably will be great for this use case. I think I can see the use case for an advanced operator to be able to have some way to runtime fine-tune Istio operation based on different things, not only this one. It's something that deserves some design doc and further consideration, because it's probably not only this one. It's other things that probably need to be fine-tuned to recover in case of emergency, and they can be automated.
Like reading through the bug in Kubernetes, right? It's pretty clear that the Kubernetes community thinks this is an issue in Kubernetes, right? The fact that they don't have shared fate is a real problem for them, right? And this must be affecting other networking solutions that rely on the API server to read out endpoints, right? Which is basically everything in the networking ecosystem today. So Kubernetes itself should be pretty motivated to make sure that shared fate is better supported.
Well, we are multi-cluster. I mean, we have other concerns than single Kubernetes life cycle.
Right. I mean, it's interesting if there's a way to detect if the partitioning is hard, right, versus soft. Like if you go from a situation where all of your endpoints were available to all of your endpoints being unready, right? That's an indication of something pretty systemic occurring in the system, and Istio should probably deal with that as a feature, not as a flag.
Yeah.
And really what we'd be looking at some form of hysteresis there, right? So doing some threshold checking on that to see if we could detect it, rather than trying to do this rely on the operator to intervene thing. I think we might want to deal with this at a slightly higher level if this is really like until Kubernetes fixes this bug, this can happen to lots of people. And expecting everybody to operate to resolve this is probably naive on our part, right? So I guess there's now this design challenge. Rather than trying to handle this by some flag, we should handle this with some threshold detection on endpoints in Kubernetes, right? Where we, like, if we see 90% of the endpoints in a Kubernetes cluster become unhealthy, that probably means the cluster's toast, right? Like either someone's taking out, like an admin is destroying the cluster deliberately, which is fine, right? Or like there's a partition with the API server of some form. And we should try and detect it. And if we can detect it, then we could switch modes, right? And maintain the unhealthy endpoint state automatically.
By the way, Istio has a way to know if endpoints are still alive because they are connected to IstioD. If an endpoint is connected to IstioD, it's probably in a pretty good shape. So, but unfortunately, we don't have a way to communicate with IstioDs and kind of, because that's kind of way to bypass and we have a cache of all endpoints that are connected.
Yeah,
it's complicated.
It's complicated. We might just be better off relying on a threshold of readiness state against a percentage of the total endpoints in the cluster.
No, I agree with you, but it may be useful to explore things where we don't depend so much on Kubernetes behaviors. I mean, where we kind of look at, maybe someone is not, previous discussion where maybe we use a different source of information for endpoints, not Kubernetes itself. So if we had we need to explore some ways to kind of, especially since we are cross-platform, multi-vendor, multi-whatever, with VMs and other things thrown in. I don't know. It's probably a long-term discussion, but doing more on our own is probably useful in many ways.
Right, but I mean, I think in general, right, like Envoy's passive health checking, right? If 90% of the endpoints are actually unhealthy, Envoy's passive health checking will deal with that, right?
Yep.
Pretty well, right? Like you'll get blips, but at least you'll go into some form of recovery state. right? Or you'll just degrade, right? Because 90% of the endpoints are actually unhealthy and they won't do anything, and you'll just, right? You'll die of natural causes. If 90% of the endpoints are just spuriously being marked as unhealthy, right? It's better in those like that threshold situation to say I'd rather rely on passive health checking than to rely on the Kubernetes API server.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe what we should look at doing, Puru, rather than trying to do something that relies on the operator, right? Which isn't, it's only going to help a very, very small percentage of users, right? If at all, right? I think we need something more automatic.
Yes, so yeah, I think relying on on-voice passive health checking was the idea we have in mind, but for that on-voice should get the endpoints, right? So
yeah, no, but what I'm saying is don't rely on the operator to make a decision about whether to report the unhealthy endpoints or not. Make that decision based on some thresholding about the percentage of endpoints in the cluster.
right.
Right, so let's say in a 5-second interval, if the API server was having a hard partition and for that reason started to mark all the endpoints in the cluster as unready, right, that would happen systematically, right? It would happen, there would be a very hard threshold that would occur. And we could detect it, right, and make a decision, oh, like X percentage of the endpoints in the cluster are being marked as unready. We should just degrade to passive health checking and use the unhealthy endpoints because anything else is strictly worse than that anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. So you're saying we will the identification detection is based on the number of endpoints getting marked as not ready. That's a detection, and how do we translate that detection into changes to the envoy? What's your suggestion there? So we will detect based
Well,
on
the
that
control plane,
rule?
like the control plane would just switch into the mode that you were, like it's right. It would just be code inside the control plane doing this.
The environment variable
sure,
becomes a variable, code variables that you set to true when this happens, and Istio the same code remains.
Yes.
Yeah, so we just
Yes.
don't
The
rely on
environment-
any external factor to set it, right? Right, so instead of the environment variable being send unhealthy endpoints equals true, the environment variable should be use unhealthy endpoints based on threshold equals, and the threshold is a percentage, right?
Yes.
And some function
Sure.
goes and checks the threshold and then updates the variable based on.
Right, but it's all internal code, right? Like we don't. That seems more reliable and is likely to yield you a better result and certainly a better MTTR, right?
Right. So yeah, I think that's a better approach. Yeah, that automates the recovery as well. Mitigation probably, if not recovery. Yeah, on the similar lines are not very different. For outlier detection as well, we do have some configuration max ejection percentage. So maybe with that such approach, which is configuration at a cluster level, do not eject all the endpoints beyond this threshold. Which is not dependent on detection at all. It's independent of detection. It's just a standard rule for the removing not ready endpoints in a limited period of time. Do you see that as a value add by decoupling it with from detection altogether?
Right, but that's an Envoy data plane feature, right? It's not a control plane feature.
Right, correct. Okay, sure. Okay, sure. I think I got your sense, got the points. Probably. So, any changes, any PRs would be acceptable if we proceed in that direction, right? Detect and introduce thresholds to the control plane.
Yeah, I think that would be a reasonable approach. Maybe like update the bug, right, to capture what we just discussed.
Sure,
and then we
I'll
could
do
maybe
that.
we could talk about what might be the appropriate triggers and how to test it. Costin, John, do you think that's a
On the
reasonable?
previous point, you could have per cluster. So for example, Istio, when it computes EDS, it can check that cluster X has 90% not ready and triggers that mode only for that cluster. So it doesn't have to be a global thing that,
Yeah, it has to be by per cluster, right? Because
yeah,
you have Istio.
but we can do it in Istio D. I mean, Istio D can do some of it. It doesn't. So we can discuss it in the PR and the detailed design. But I completely agree. It's a better solution for this use case.
Sure. Okay, Peru, are you okay doing that? Updating the bug. Let's have some discussion about how to the details of how this should be implemented, but just outline it and maybe rename the bug, right, to track the fact that it's for dynamic detection and remediation without operator.
Yeah, I'll update the bug accordingly. Yes.
Okay, awesome. No, thanks for it's definitely an interesting use case, and the Kubernetes bug itself should still get fixed, but the same thing could occur with actually any source of endpoints, not just Kubernetes. So I think we need to be cognizant of this regardless. And it is a way to improve the aggregate SLO of the system in degraded states. So I think users will appreciate it.
So at this juncture, I would like to do a time check. We are 16 minutes past the original time already. Can folks stay around and at least get through Peru's next item?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd like to get through the next 3 if we can.
Okay. Well, let's do
I know.
So I have to drop at around 10:30 or so, but rest you folks feel free to stay and finish. So next one is also yours, Peru.
Yes. So the ask here is more from a admin persona. So when I say persona, we are looking at two personas. One is Istio administrator or service mesh administrator, and the other one is namespace owners, right? So the namespace could be now just a application, and some other namespaces could be platform services, which will be used by many application systems, right? So we have 2 types of workloads that are part of the mesh, right? So now all the individual workloads, applications are dependent on the platform services. So now as part of a sidecar in egress whitelisting, namespace whitelisting, all the application namespaces have to get whitelisted to contact to the namespace platform service namespaces. So that's where there are 2 options here. The application namespaces could individually whitelist all the platform applications, or an ability to the service mesh administrator to do that whitelisting centrally, and that gets defaulted to all the namespaces in the service mesh. So we are asking for the latter cluster service mesh administrator having an ability to whitelist all platform namespaces centrally. Right now, there is a Istio root namespace having ability to define sidecar configuration centrally, but that gets overwritten completely when in the namespace a sidecar config is defined for the workload. That's the limitation we are observing.
So historically, we have a few features that do merges like this with defaults and overrides. Virtual services come to mind. And they have been the source of a decent amount of added complexity in the product and generated confusion on the part of users. They've also been valuable. It's not that there's no value to this, but I'm wondering, would it be possible to accomplish the same thing using, say, Kustomize?
No, Okay. Yeah, I think probably at the moment our deployments are not happening centrally. Maybe I see your point. If deployments of all the services are happening centrally, the customers you can be used, and in the CD pipelines, these additional defaultings can be done. Yeah, I see your point, but uh, hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
there's even a fair
Go
amount
ahead.
of infrastructure out there to help people with these kinds of problems. Even if you don't have a CI/CD pipeline, right? There are, mutating webhooks, systems for automating mutating webhooks and doing configuration patching. I believe there are many projects in the ecosystem that help with that problem. I think there are
Right.
even ones that work with customized Mitch, right?
Yeah.
I don't claim to know all of them off the top of my head because there are so many. I don't know which is the flavor of the month, but there are certainly ways to achieve that effect.
So the point I am hearing is we don't see a way where a service mesh administrator being able to configure such parameters centrally. Instead, the infrastructure like customize or CD pipelines or mutating webhook has to address for such controls. Is the direction?
Yeah, I think that would be my first instinct, because what you're talking about is really meta policy. It's policy about policy. And ideally, we would keep Istio from a sort of scope creep into that space if there are other vendors who offer it that work well with Istio. If there's something we're missing here, and those particular solutions are not suitable, then I would be interested in reopening discussion. But that would be my sort of default response.
Yeah, we try to stay away from becoming a templating system, right, for want of a better term. We've done, like earlier in the discussion, for example, right, the x.z, those types of customizations, right, we do provide first-class support for, because they require deep integration through the control plane and the data plane. But if the customization you want can be achieved at or above the API level, then we generally prefer that you do it there. Particularly because things like this, they may vary like pretty widely among deployments, right? Your rules for defaulting or the complexity that you need around defaulting may exceed our ability to represent that in any like limited templating system we might try and provide. Right, what you say is, okay, well, if the namespace is labeled this way, then use this template. Else, if it's labeled this way, use that template. Right, and then, right, like the scope creep just starts to go crazy. And there are systems that already provide for those types of things. And we've certainly seen that before in other deployments, right, where like people have these kind of defaulting requests, but then when they actually get to start doing them, they find that they need a little bit more operational control based on their understanding of their context and deployment. Context that we can't possibly represent really without having a much more complicated API, at which point, right, we probably shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, I see the rationale and discretion. Yes, I think I'm aligned. So I'll take back these inputs and approach accordingly. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, and as Mitch said, like like if there's something more specific, right, something that requires an integration end to end through the data plane or has interaction with the APIs or the data plane in a kind of deeper sense, then those are the things that we try and address. But if it can be represented at or above the API level, then it's probably good to use some other system.
Sure.
Certainly for people who have CI/CD pipelines and are using Helm, right, they do this a lot.
Got it.
Okay, maybe we should move on to the next one.
Okay, sounds good. Josh Tischer, demo Terraform, Proud Infrastructure.
I'm here, and I'm happy to share.
Yeah, feel free to take over.
Yeah, thank you very much. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Josh Tischer. I'm a DevOps engineer over here at Aspen Mesh, and we've been working on this project to terraform the Prout infrastructure side of things. We know that it's sort of been a pet for you guys, and there's not been a nice automated way to rebuild it. So what we're going to do is I was just going to share what we've done so far, and talk through what we can do here, and possibly share with the community. Sorry, I'm trying to unlock the my Mac is asking for permissions for sharing screen, so if it's going to let me. Oh, I've got to go to system preferences, and oh, come on, please. Sorry about that, guys. Now I should have permissions. Of course, I lost all my history too. Sorry, thanks for bearing with me here. Cool. So I diagrammed out a bit of what we were doing here before I show the Terraform, but what we've done is we stood up a GKE cluster. We followed all the hardening guides, and worked through. You guys can all see my screen, right? Let me know if you can't. Anyway, so we've created a GKE cluster. We followed the hardening guides, and I've decided to set up and use IAP to help secure the cluster. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with IAP, but it's an identity-aware access proxy, and that allows us to control access for SSH and things to like Bastion host, or to, for instance, for like the Prout dashboard through a Google group, which is pretty nice. So we've decided to break all this up and turn this into some Terraform and turn this into infrastructure as code. This is basically very standard to what you guys have already have in operation. We haven't taken it as far as creating multiple Kubernetes clusters. So I guess the question for the community here is how you are operating multiple clusters. Do you have one team that's managing multiple clusters? Do you have multiple teams managing the multiple clusters? And what value we can help bring for the community in operating these clusters. Anyway, so moving on, if you guys don't want to, and I can throw out some questions towards the end. So what we've got here is our Terraform. If anybody wants to give some feedback, would be really great. We've laid this out in several layers. So the first layer here is the OO folder, and what we're doing is doing some basic Google Cloud setup, account setup for things like a Terraform automation service account, the DNS zone, that kind of stuff to get the account sort of primed and ready for us to run Terraform against. And then we've got a couple other layers that we've built for isolation purposes so that we can spin up and tear down as we need. and have less problems with Terraform and managing state. So I've separated out like the infrastructure Google Cloud sort of layer of networking, VPCs, infrastructure, networks, the actual GKE cluster itself, from the O2 folder, which is really like meant to be customizing and installing and tweaking service accounts and the things that we need to operate Prow. So things like if we look at service accounts, we have all of these codified now. So, and we've followed the convention that's in the test infra repo. So you'll see that like Prow Deployer is a service account that already exists. So everything that we have mimics what's already in the test infra repo. And we've done our best communicating with John to get the privileges that these service accounts might need. And we're trying to follow a better practice of using workload identities. And I've noticed that there are some improvements in moving towards workload identities in the Prow deployments, which is really nice. So managing these service accounts here in code, I think, is going to be potentially really nice for the community and to be able to manage and operate these clusters. Does anybody have any real questions, thoughts, things that they really want to see here? I'm happy to also show that this cluster is up and running. We do have Prow installed. And this is all from a federated login, which is pretty nice. So yeah, just the normal Prow dashboard. We're still working through getting jobs to run. So is this, I think the question here is this valuable for the community? Is this something that you guys want to see? Do you have feedback for me? Things you want to see changed? Details that you'd like me to walk through?
Do we have folks from build, test, and do we have any of the BTR working group leads here?
I think that's just Eric.
Yeah, we do. Although I'm curious what's going to happen as we have to stand this up going forward. So, and I will claim that I am a little ignorant of Prow since we don't use that here. So I think this is good. Certainly going forward, we're probably going to need something to do with this, but I just don't know exactly what.
Yeah, if the migration path I could see being challenging to migrate from what we have for building Istio to something like this. So totally open for discussion, improvements, what that might look like, how we can collaborate on some of that.
I think I might have missed a little bit of context. Is the existing Prow infrastructure expected to go away?
No, so so one of the things that we needed a new way to build Istio, and as such, we wanted to build it in infrastructure as code so we could make it rebuildable. And as we're going through this project, we're asking the question: does this make sense to provide to upstream, and is this valuable for the community to make your lives easier?
For my part, I see a ton of value in this for Istio contributing companies who need to stand up their own infrastructure but don't have Prow expertise. Like if IBM wanted to spin up their own Prow infrastructure and carry over, that makes total sense. The existing infrastructure, the advantage that we have today is that it's supported by Google Engprod. It's actually supported by some of the authors of Prow. So I'd be hesitant to migrate off of that as a project. But as something that other vendors can use to pick up to sort of spin up their own copy of the infrastructure, I think this is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Mitch. And I didn't mean to imply that we would be spinning off of what we're doing today. I don't know what the answer to that is. That's somebody that hasn't asked me, or I haven't been privy to that conversation, but I assume we can continue with what we have today.
Yeah, the infrastructure that we're on is actually shared infrastructure with Kubernetes internal at Google. And so I would expect that we'd be able to continue on that. I've not heard otherwise. Louis, have you?
I would be surprised if that was changing. I haven't heard anything. So
yeah. And the other piece of this that was a driver for us is you know, I was sort of informed that there might be some audits coming up on the infrastructure side for your installation of Prow, and I wasn't sure if there was, or it doesn't seem like there is, infrastructure as code for it. So this is really like meant to be really beneficial to all. But if really this is only beneficial for companies that are needing to build Istio, you know, it's certainly a conversation we can have.
Very cool.
yeah, I mean, clearly, at least for that use case, right? I mean, obviously, this is extremely useful.
If you have some public links to this, Josh, I'd love to point some of our prod people at it and just have them take a look.
Yeah, there's not yet, and I would need to clean it up. I can certainly make you know, work with Jacob, and I can figure out a way to make this public enough for somebody to look at it. I can make that a project.
Maybe I'll have our Inchprod folks reach out to you on the Slack in the meantime. Can I get up?
That would be great. Yeah.
Cool.
Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks, Josh. John, I think you have the last item.
And I was going to say, I think it looked like he dropped.
Did he drop? I guess a bunch of people dropped. We are pretty far over at this point. Should we just bump it to the next one, or?
Yeah. That's what I would say.
Okay, let's do that then. Let's set up the agenda for that one. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks.